The night air over Washington in the summer of 1952 was warm and unhurried, the kind of air that seemed to hum faintly with the residue of a long, sunlit day. Heat lingered between the streets, and even after midnight the sidewalks seemed to remember the light. The monuments along the Potomac stood still beneath a sky the color of deep velvet, the city's soft glow rising like a pale mist that brushed the undersides of drifting clouds. Somewhere a lone cicada rasped in a rhythm that only summer could understand, while the faint sound of traffic murmured far off. A car gliding down Constitution Avenue, a late bus sighing at a stoplight, the faint clatter of a newsboy's bicycle. It was July, and the capital was in its midsummer lull, those slow, hazy weeks when even the most industrious offices worked at half their usual pace. The city breathed quietly, wrapped in the hum of ceiling fans and the whisper of paperwork. Air conditioners were rare enough that windows stayed open, letting the night wander in. Washington, in those days, was a place of both order and unease, a city of marble dignity and subtle restlessness. The Second World War had ended only 7 years before, and though the peace had held, a new kind of tension had crept into the world. In quiet rooms, men discussed atomic secrets. In classrooms, children practiced ducking under desks. The Cold War was still young, a shadow that stretched softly across the Atlantic and settled like a thought in the back of the nation's mind. But if the days were shaped by politics and policy, the nights belonged to the sky. The early 1950s were an age of wonder above all else, an age when flight had begun to capture the imagination like never before. Jet engines roared higher and faster. Airliners traced new paths between continents, and experimental aircraft reached for altitudes once reserved for dreams. People looked up more often than they once did. Every contrail, every faint gleam in the heavens seemed to hint that the future was unfolding quietly over their heads. That summer, the newspapers had been full of headlines about speed and exploration. Test pilots broke altitude records in the deserts of California. Astronomers wrote about the red glow of Mars and the glimmering storms on Jupiter. To many, the sky no longer seemed unreachable. It was becoming part of daily life. It was easy, then, to imagine that something new might happen there, something strange, yet oddly beautiful. And so the summer drifted on, serene and unassuming. The Potomac shimmered beneath the bridges, carrying the moonlight like a secret. The dome of the Capitol stood watchful and pale against the stars. The air above the city was busy, though few thought about it. Commercial flights gliding in from the north and south, radar operators tracing their gentle arcs on glowing screens, weather balloons rising silently to the upper winds. In that soft machinery of the night, men and women worked their quiet shifts, unseen, but essential. Tower controllers murmuring into radios, meteorologists noting the layers of humidity, radar technicians adjusting dials with practiced patience. They were the unseen rhythm of Washington after dark. It was a time when the city still slept easily. The streets emptied early, the lights dimmed, and the sky reclaimed its place. From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the reflecting pool stretched in liquid stillness, broken only by the ripple of a stray breeze. Beyond it, the Washington Monument pierced the sky like a narrow silver flame, steady and sure. Few could have imagined that, in a matter of nights, the skies above these landmarks, skies that had watched over presidents and protests, inaugurations and celebrations, would become the quiet stage for something unexplainable. But the story of that summer was not one of alarm. It was one of curiosity, a slow unfolding of mystery in the gentlest possible way. The events that would soon stir headlines around the world began not with thunder or spectacle, but with the faintest electronic whisper on a radar screen, a small blip moving in a way that no known aircraft should. Then another still. For those who would be on duty that night, it was just another shift in a long season of humid evenings. The radar rooms were kept cool by old fans, their metal blades humming softly as the air shimmered with cigarette smoke and the faint scent of coffee gone cold. Screens glowed green against the dimness, dots appearing and fading, each one a trace of motion somewhere high above. The operators spoke in low tones, their voices steady, almost drowsy. Outside, the city lay unaware, sleeping beneath the quiet sky. And yet, above that sky, somewhere between the towers of light and the edge of the stars, something was moving. Something that would be seen by pilots, tracked by radar, and later debated in meeting rooms across the country. For the people of Washington, the next few weeks would bring stories of glowing lights drifting over the Capitol, strange patterns in the night, and whispered speculations that stretched from the Air Force to ordinary citizens gazing up from their porches. But for now, in this beginning, there was only stillness, the warm air, the patient rhythm of the night, the unseen hum of machines working through the dark. The world was quieter then. Radios crackled softly, newspapers rustled in the hands of half-asleep readers, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. If you could stand on the Mall that night, you would feel it, that particular calm that belongs to summer nights in the city. You would hear the faint echo of footsteps across the stone pathways, the rustle of leaves stirred by passing cars, and the low whistle of a distant train threading through the dark. Overhead, the constellations were steady and ancient, yet somehow more mysterious than ever, as if waiting. The air itself seemed to hold a question, one that no one had yet thought to ask. In the coming days, the word flying saucer would be whispered again and again, and reporters would rush to print headlines that blended science and speculation. But here, in this moment, before the story begins, none of that exists yet. There is only the night, deep, warm, and endlessly still. The people of Washington sleep beneath their fans and open windows, unaware that the sky above them will soon draw the world's gaze. The night hums gently, like a machine left running in another room. In that sound, the mixture of city and summer, there is comfort. The Potomac moves softly under its bridges, carrying faint reflections of streetlights and stars. The breeze shifts just enough to stir the flag on the White House lawn. Somewhere, a plane turns slowly toward the runway lights at National Airport, descending through the hazy layers of air. Its engines are low and steady, its landing smooth, its presence ordinary. And yet, somewhere out there, beyond the reach of those same lights, something else drifts, unseen for now, patient, calm, and waiting to be noticed. It would not be long before the radar screens began to flicker before the quiet voices in the control rooms began to ask one another what they were seeing before the city that symbolized order and reason found itself at the heart of one of history's most mysterious nights. But tonight, in this quiet introduction, nothing stirs. The story has not yet begun to unfold. The city sleeps. The sky holds its breath, and time itself seems to pause, a moment of perfect stillness before wonder begins its slow descent. It was the night of July 19th, 1952. The air over Washington had softened into the kind of warmth that feels almost motionless, as if the entire city had decided to rest. From the control tower windows at Washington National Airport, the view stretched out across the Potomac, a broad, dark ribbon, reflecting the faint gleam of distant lights. Beyond it, the monuments stood quiet and unchanging, their reflections trembling in the water whenever a light breeze passed. Inside the radar room, the world felt smaller, enclosed in the hush of machines and the soft hum of electricity. The walls carried the faint scent of metal and ozone, and the green glow of cathode screens painted gentle halos on the operators' faces. They sat at their consoles in loose shirts, with sleeves rolled to the elbows, murmuring now and then into headsets or tapping at dials with absent patience. Most nights were like this, steady, predictable, and almost hypnotic. The radar pings were their lullaby, regular as a heartbeat. On duty that night was Harry Barnes, a calm and practiced controller. He'd worked countless summer nights, just like this one, monitoring the slow dance of incoming and outgoing flights. The radar's circular sweep made its familiar sound, a faint electronic tick every few seconds, the beam tracing a circle of green that faded, renewed, and faded again. On the screens, each small dot represented something real, moving through the dark sky. A passenger plane heading toward Richmond, a private Cessna drifting along the coast, a cargo flight making its slow approach to Baltimore. At first, the shift was uneventful. The usual chatter filled the airwaves, pilot check-ins, altitude confirmations, small talk about the weather. The radio voices were soft and professional, each sentence ending with the calm certainty of routine. Out on the runway, lights blinked in a straight line, guiding the occasional aircraft home through the haze. Then, around midnight, something curious began to appear. A faint echo blinked onto the radar screen just east of the city, small, distinct, and oddly out of place. It wasn't on any scheduled flight path. Barnes leaned in slightly, adjusting the brightness knob to be sure. The dot moved slowly, then suddenly accelerated in a way no commercial plane could. Within moments, another appeared, then a third. He watched them drift across the scope, moving at irregular speeds, at times almost still, then darting in a quick, graceful line before halting again. He called over another operator, who peered closely and frowned. The radar beam swept again. The dots remained. They checked for equipment malfunctions, toggling switches and recentering the scope. Everything worked perfectly. The echoes were there, solid, real, and moving in ways no aircraft on the flight board were known to move. Barnes radioed the control tower to ask if anything unusual was visible outside. The answer came back in the same steady tone that filled every night shift. Nothing unusual reported. Skies clear. But a few miles away, at Andrews Air Force Base, radar operators were seeing the same thing. On their own screens, unfamiliar targets had appeared, flickering in and out, their paths unpredictable. The night, which had been ordinary only minutes before, now seemed to hum with quiet attention. Up above, airline pilots cruising at altitude noticed faint lights, small, glowing orbs that drifted in the distance, sometimes merging, sometimes pulling apart. They didn't flash like aircraft beacons. They didn't move in straight lines. They floated, pulsing faintly, like slow-moving fireflies, far above the earth. Still, no one panicked. This was Washington, a city accustomed to order, even in the face of the unexplained. In the radar room, Barnes remained composed, speaking softly into his microphone, logging the time and position of each sighting. His voice, even then, was calm, the voice of someone determined to understand, not to fear. Target sighted, moving southeast, speed fluctuating. Now stationary. His words, recorded later, would describe not alarm but fascination. As the hours passed, the radar screens continued to light up. At one moment, there were as many as 7 unidentified returns over the city, some hovering above the White House, others drifting near the Capitol dome. The men in the radar room exchanged quiet glances, but said little. They had work to do, and the routine of duty held steady. Outside, the city remained unaware. Taxis moved along empty streets. The Potomac shimmered in silence. The night seemed as it always was, its mysteries hidden from those below. The strange lights, if visible at all from the ground, were distant and faint, like stars that had simply chosen to wander for a while. Over time, the radar echoes would vanish, reappear, then vanish again. To the operators, it felt as though something intelligent were moving just beyond reach, aware of their instruments and their curiosity. But that was only a feeling, and feelings had no place on the flight logs. They continued to record the events as data, speed, altitude, coordinates, simple, neutral numbers that could not capture the quiet awe in the room. In those moments between sweeps of the radar beam, the hum of the equipment seemed to deepen, filling the silence like the breathing of the night itself. The faint tapping of typewriter keys joined it, steady and rhythmic. Cigarette smoke drifted toward the ceiling, curling into shapes that caught the greenish light before fading. Hours later, near dawn, the radar screens finally cleared. The unknown echoes faded one by one, leaving behind only the ordinary flight paths of scheduled aircraft. The operators looked at each other and exchanged tired smiles. Whatever it was gone now. The logbooks were filled with coordinates, the radios quiet once more. The night had returned to its usual rhythm, but the story did not end there. When the morning came, sunlight spilling across the Potomac and over the marble steps of the monuments, reports began to circulate quietly. The operators at Andrews confirmed the same anomalies. Pilots spoke of unusual lights, and by afternoon, word had reached the Air Force. The first whispers of something extraordinary began to move through the corridors of command. For the people who had been there that night, it felt unreal, not frightening, but otherworldly in its stillness. Barnes would later recall how calm everything had seemed, even as their instruments tracked objects that defied ordinary explanation. There was a kind of peace to it, he said, as though they were witnessing something that did not belong to panic, but to wonder. And in the memory of that night, there remained a single enduring image, a radar room filled with quiet concentration, the slow rotation of a beam across a glowing screen, and the faint sense that somewhere beyond the reach of the machines, the sky was alive with quiet movement. If you could have stood outside on that night, on the steps of the Capitol, or along the edge of the reflecting pool, you might have seen them too. Small points of light, moving slowly, gracefully, across the upper air. The sound around you would have been unchanged. The rustle of leaves, the hum of distant cars, the chirp of night insects. The city itself offered no reaction, no sign that history was quietly unfolding above it. Even those who saw the lights that night often hesitated to speak. In 1952, the idea of flying saucers belonged mostly to headlines and rumor. Few wanted to sound imaginative in a world governed by logic and protocol. And yet, there they were, lights that moved without sound, that stopped without drifting, that vanished and returned without explanation. For Barnes and his team, it was a mystery that arrived and departed with the same quiet grace. As dawn stretched across the city, they packed away their notes and left the radar room blinking under fluorescent light. The air outside felt cool and damp, and the smell of the river drifted faintly through the open doors. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that comes just before sunrise. Somewhere above, commercial flights resumed their morning routes, silver wings glinting faintly in the first light. The world went on. Newspapers printed their usual stories, commuters filled the buses, and the strange events of the night remained, for now, a quiet secret between a handful of watchful men and the silent summer sky. But that night, the first night of the Washington sightings, had left an impression that none of them could easily forget. Something had moved through the airspace above the Capitol, not hostile, not loud, but impossibly strange. In the calm heart of that July darkness, the sky had whispered a question, and only a few had been awake to hear it. And the faint hum of another night's work filled the control rooms. No one knew it yet, but the skies over Washington would not stay quiet for long. The mystery had only begun to unfold. The first night of radar echoes had settled quietly into memory by the time the next evening drifted over Washington. The city resumed its gentle rhythm, as if the sky's mysterious visitors had been no more than a passing curiosity. Yet something lingered in the warm July air, a subtle sense of expectancy, though few could have named it. The sun dipped behind the horizon, leaving behind streaks of rose and amber that slowly faded into twilight. On the ground, the monuments glowed with their steady, familiar illumination. The Lincoln Memorial radiated a soft, white serenity, its columns standing like patient sentinels watching over the reflecting pool. The Washington Monument cast a long, unwavering reflection on the still water below. Night came quietly, almost tenderly, wrapping the city in its wide, velvet embrace. Up in the control tower, the atmosphere was calm and unhurried. Pilots called in their positions, voices steady and routine. The runways glimmered with amber and white lights, stretched out like luminous threads, guiding each aircraft home. Everything appeared normal, stable, predictable. But at about 9 o'clock, pilots in the darkening sky began to notice something unusual. Captain S.C. Casey Pierman, flying an incoming commercial flight, first saw them as small, shimmering points of light far above the horizon. At first, he assumed they were stars, perhaps distorted slightly by the lingering haze. But stars do not move, and these lights certainly did. One drifted slowly across the sky, pausing in a way no star or plane ever could. Another glided in a gentle arc, brightening as it moved. They were soft lights, not sharp or glaring, and their motion held a strange grace. Pierman watched in silence for a moment, unsure of what he was seeing. The lights were not blinking, nor did they trail smoke or sound. They resembled distant lanterns, drifting freely wherever the night breeze might take them. But he was 30 years into his career, and he knew the sky intimately, every kind of star, every scattered reflection, every atmospheric trick that could tease a tired pilot's eyes. This was something different. He radioed the control tower in his usual calm voice, describing faint lights moving above the city. His tone carried no alarm, only curiosity. The tower, accustomed to careful observation, asked a few routine questions. How many lights? How fast? At what altitude? Pierman gave his best estimates as he continued his descent, watching the lights shift and drift like luminous petals in a dark current. Meanwhile, on the ground, another set of eyes caught sight of the same strange brilliance. A tower controller looked up from his desk after hearing Pierman's report. Through the wide glass windows he expected to see nothing more than the distant glimmer of city lights, or perhaps the faint trail of a departing plane. But there they were, 3 pale round lights hovering above the river, steady and silent. They weren't sharp like aircraft beacons. They glowed more like reflections on water, except they floated far above the rooftops. He called for another controller to join him. Together, they watched as the lights moved across the sky in a slow, drifting formation. At moments, they seemed to fade into the background of stars, then reappear with a soft pulse. The movement was neither abrupt nor threatening. Instead, it felt oddly serene, like the sky was performing a quiet ritual only a few were awake to see. Farther out, other pilots began reporting similar sights. One described the lights as like fireflies, but brighter. Another mentioned that they appeared smooth and controlled, as if guided by an unseen, gentle hand. None of them expressed fear. Most reports were spoken in tones of puzzled fascination, as though the sky had unveiled a peaceful secret. Back inside the National Airport radar room, the same glowing returns from the previous night began to appear once more. Harry Barnes, now alert with a quiet sense of recognition, leaned closer to the scope. The blips moved slowly, then stopped, then darted away before settling again. Each movement was swift but deliberate, lacking the jitter or distortion typical of radar error. Barnes radioed Andrews Air Force Base to confirm if they were seeing the same activity. Their reply came back steadily. Echoes confirmed, from 3 different places: the sky, the tower, and the radar screens. The reports harmonized like separate instruments in a single, gentle refrain. Above the Capitol dome, where the soft glow of floodlights illuminated the limestone facade, the lights drifted with a dreamlike presence. They weren't bright enough to draw attention from the citizens on evening strolls below. But for those whose eyes were trained on the sky, their movement was unmistakable. They floated above the city like wandering stars, suspended in an ocean of warm summer darkness. One pilot described seeing a cluster of lights gliding together before separating into individual paths. At times, the lights would pause, as if contemplating the world beneath them, hovering silently before continuing on. They remained blissfully unaware of the mysterious company sharing the night sky with their plane. Only the pilots, watching with quiet concentration, witnessed the ballet of glimmering shapes beyond their windows. On the ground, the controllers remained composed. They tracked the lights on radar, watched them through binoculars, and logged each sighting with measured precision. The soft clicking of typewriter keys filled the room as notes were taken, times, directions, speeds, yet no sense of danger entered the rhythm of their work. Everything about the lights felt strangely calm. Occasionally, a light would glow a little brighter, then fade again. Some moved as swiftly as the fastest aircraft of the day, then slowed to a near standstill. But none approached the airport, none interfered with the flights, and none behaved in a way that suggested hostility. They simply existed, drifting in the warm summer air, like visitors passing through without any urgency or concern. Over the river, the Potomac reflected the moon and the faint specks above, turning the water into a soft mirror of light. The breeze carried the distant scent of damp earth and stone, and even the nighttime insects seemed to pause now and then, as if sensing the quiet strangeness overhead. By midnight, the lights grew fewer. One by one, they dimmed or drifted away toward the outskirts of the city. The radar echoes dwindled. Andrews reported only a few lingering targets. Pilots mentioned the last faint glimmers, then nothing more. The sky slowly returned to its familiar stillness. For those who had seen the lights firsthand, the memory settled gently, without fear, like remembering a strange but beautiful dream. Upon waking, they continued their shift, returned to their routines, and wrote their reports with level-headed care. But inside, they carried the quiet wonder of having witnessed something rare, something that moved differently from anything they knew. Later, some would speak of the lights with almost poetic softness, describing the sense of peace that accompanied them. The sky had felt vast, alive, and curious, not threatening, but aware, somehow, of being watched. For the second night in a row, the skies above Washington had hosted a visitor whose presence was felt rather than understood. The lights had appeared without warning, danced silently across the Capitol, and vanished into the summer dark as easily as they had arrived. The city remained unaware of the quiet spectacle overhead. Newspapers would not yet carry the story. Most Washingtonians slept beneath their open windows, cooled by the faint breeze and the hum of cicadas. But somewhere above their dreaming minds, the sky had carried its gentle, glowing secret once again. And in the control tower, as the last hour of the shift approached, the controllers stepped outside to breathe the night air. They looked up at the stars, searching for any lingering traces. The sky appeared ordinary now, calm and empty. Yet for a moment, they imagined they could still sense the faint paths where the lights had drifted, like footprints left in the heavens, slowly fading, but not entirely gone. The night was silent once more. But those who had witnessed the lights knew that something remarkable had passed quietly above the Capitol, leaving only the softest ripple of wonder behind it. And though they did not yet know it, the events of the following weekend would return that wonder to the sky in an even more vivid display, drawing the palate's attention of not just radar operators and pilots, but of the entire nation. For now, the city slept, the sky rested, and the memory of the gentle lights hovered in the minds of those who had watched them, a mystery drifting just beyond the reach of words. After the night of July 19th, Washington found itself suspended in an unusual stillness, a quiet that felt as though the air itself was waiting for something. Newspapers continued buzzing, radio hosts continued speculating, and military officials continued debating behind closed doors. And yet, beneath the surface of public chatter and official statements, the people of Washington returned to their routines, or tried to. Streetcars rattled down Pennsylvania Avenue. Diplomats walked briskly across the steps of federal buildings. Tourists posed for photographs outside the monument-lined mall. Life resumed its normal rhythm, but not the sky. The sky remembered. And 1 week later, on the evening of Saturday, July 26, 1952, that memory would return in full force. In the early evening hours, The air above Washington felt unusually warm and heavy. Twilight had only begun to fade when the first calls came in, 9:08 p.m. A pilot, preparing for takeoff from Washington National Airport, radioed the tower with a curious note. "Tower, I'm seeing something strange to the west. Looks like lights, maybe reflections." Or the transmission trailed off before returning with more certainty. "No, they're moving now, fast." The tower operator paused, glanced instinctively through the glass windows overlooking the runway, and felt his breath catch just slightly. "They're faint, but unmistakable. Small points of light drifting where no aircraft should be." He picked up the phone to notify the radar room. This time, no one hesitated. Inside the Andrews Air Force Base Radar Center, the atmosphere had been calm for most of the evening. Coffee cups sat half-finished, headsets draped loosely around necks, conversations quiet and routine. But that calm shattered at 9:27 p.m. when the radar screens flickered with sudden activity. Green blips, sharp, distinct, and fast-moving, appeared out of nowhere. The operator leaned forward, adjusting the dials to rule out static interference. The blips remained, then multiplied, then accelerated. "Control, we've got unknowns again. Same pattern as last week." A second operator looked up from his screen, and then a third. One of them whispered, "Not again." Yet it wasn't fear guiding their voices. It was something softer, a kind of bewildered awe, familiar from the previous week, but still inexplicable. The shapes on the radar moved with fluidity, not darting erratically like aircraft in a dogfight, nor gliding smoothly like civilian planes. They moved as though they were part of a single, coordinated dance. At times, they would hover motionless. Then they would flash across the screen with impossible acceleration. Not hostile, but undeniably deliberate. The operators watched, transfixed. On the ground, people started noticing too. A young couple strolling along the Potomac stopped mid-conversation when they saw glowing spheres drifting silently above the Lincoln Memorial. A taxi driver, pulling up to Union Station, stepped out of his cab when a cluster of soft orange lights passed high overhead, moving without sound. A Capitol police officer on night shift paused beneath a lamppost, one hand instinctively resting on his belt as he stared upwards, unable to explain what he was seeing. But unlike the first wave, there was something gentler about this night. The lights didn't rush. They didn't dart between landmarks. They didn't tease the jets or hover provocatively above restricted airspace. Instead, they floated, slowly, gracefully, as if simply passing through. Inside the Pentagon, officers were already gathering. The memory of the first wave was still fresh, and this time the military hierarchy had prepared. Phone lines lit up, files were retrieved. Duty officers arrived, still buttoning their jackets, as reports flowed in from both radar centers and civilian witnesses. In a conference room lined with maps, 3 senior officers stood around a table illuminated by a single overhead lamp. No one raised their voice. Instead, they spoke in low, measured tones, as though the quietness of the night demanded respect. "We scramble the jets again. We can't ignore them. We need visual confirmation this time." At 11:30 p.m., the order went out. 2 F-9 4 Starfire jets were scrambled from Andrews, engines igniting in a roar that split the stillness of the night. Captain William Patterson led the pair of interceptors into the sky, climbing steadily into the dark expanse above Washington. He had flown during the first wave too. He remembered the lights then, how they vanished the moment he approached, leaving only the hum of his engine and the emptiness of the sky. Tonight felt different. As he leveled his altitude and set his course, the radio crackled. "Captain Patterson, unknown targets directly ahead to miles. Altitude matching yours." He stared into the night but saw nothing at first. Then, just as he prepared to adjust his heading, the darkness lit up with faint, glowing orbs. They appeared not with a flash, but the way stars slowly reveal themselves as the eye adjusts, gentle points of radiance, forming a loose ring ahead of him. Not aggressive, just present. He felt his grip tighten on the controls. "Control, I'm surrounded." His voice was steady, not fearful, just astonished. In his small cockpit, thousands of feet above the sleeping city, he felt as though he had entered a different realm, where the usual rules of flight and distance and orientation didn't teefully apply. The lights held their positions around him for several seconds, drifting in a smooth formation. One moved slightly closer, glowing with a warm, almost amber hue, and then, as if concluding their silent inspection, they lifted, rising together with fluid precision. Higher, higher still, until they vanished into the deep velvet of the night sky. Patterson took a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Back on the ground, the second wave brought something the first had not, a sense of reflection. People watched the skies, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. The light's movements, too gentle to be threatening, left many with a feeling of wonder. A night shift reporter, standing on the roof of the Washington Post building, scribbled notes while staring upward, his usual cynicism replaced by childlike fascination. A bus driver paused his route near the Navy Yard, letting passengers step out to see the glowing dots weaving slowly across the sky. Families stood on their porches. Soldiers on guard duty leaned on their rifles. Diplomats peered through embassy windows. For a brief moment, Washington, a city often divided by politics, bureaucracy, and ideology, looked upward together. The lights continued their slow passage across the night, unhurried and undisturbed, weaving between clouds, as though following pathways invisible to human eyes. Just after 2 a.m., the radar screens at Andrews and National began to clear. One by one, the blips faded. Operators leaned back in their chairs, eyes tired but wide with the memory of what they had witnessed yet again. Papers rustled, phones clicked back onto receivers. A few exchanged quiet remarks, but most simply sat in stillness, processing. There had been no misreadings, no weather anomalies, no temperature inversions, or equipment errors. The second wave had been real, unmistakably, undeniably real. But the meaning behind it remained just beyond reach. As dawn approached, the city returned to its familiar calm. Streetlights flickered off, the Potomac shimmered with early morning light. The monuments stood stoic and unmoving, as they always had, and yet something had changed. Not in the marble statues or the domed buildings, but in the hearts of the people who had witnessed the lights for the second time. There was a shared, unspoken awareness now that the world might be larger, stranger, and far more beautiful than previously understood. Even those who had not seen the lights directly felt the weight of the moment. Conversations over breakfast included whispered questions. Newspaper vendors set out early editions with headlines that barely contained their astonishment. But above all, there was a sense of peace. The lights hadn't come to frighten or threaten. They had come quietly, moved gracefully, left without harm, almost like travelers passing through the night, acknowledging the human world below with a gentle nod before continuing their journey. And as Washington settled back into its routines, no one could shake the feeling that they had been part of something rare, an encounter not with danger, but with mystery. A reminder that even in a city defined by certainty, there were still moments that invited wonder. Still nights where the sky opened just enough to hint at something beyond, something vast, something silent, something curious, something watching. And just like that, the second wave was over. A story that would linger, echo, and eventually slip quietly into history, like lights fading into the dawn. The sun had barely risen when the phone lines inside the Pentagon began to hum again. It was the morning of July 27th, 1952, only hours after the second wave of sightings. And while most of Washington was still waking up, the heart of the nation's defense establishment was already in motion. Unlike the first wave, which had been brushed off by many as an oddity or radar malfunction, the new reports were more numerous, more credible, and more unsettling to officials. Civilian witnesses, military radar operators, pilots, and law enforcement officers had all described the same glowing objects. The pressure to respond had escalated overnight. And so, while the city outside moved at its usual slow Sunday pace, the Pentagon buzzed with a kind of nervous, concentrated energy rarely seen outside wartime. The Pentagon in the early morning had its own character, quiet hallways echoing with footsteps, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, officers arriving with coffee cups in hand, newspapers tucked under their arms. Today, that calm lasted less than an hour. Shortly after 7 a.m., a junior intelligence officer hurried into a secure conference room carrying a stack of fresh reports. Behind him, a major followed with a folder labeled Confidential Aircraft Incidents. A colonel entered next, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the room, already preparing for an exhausting day. Within minutes, the door closed and the meeting began. The room was dimly lit, with blinds drawn and a large map of the eastern United States displayed on the wall. A projector sat ready on the table, its whirry fan marking time like a metronome. Major General John Samford, the Director of Air Force Intelligence, sat at the head of the table. His face looked composed, but the lines around his eyes revealed a man carrying the weight of expectation and uncertainty. The briefing officer began. "Gentlemen, we have a situation." He clicked a button, and the projector illuminated the wall with a series of radar plots from the previous night, sharp blips, moving in unconventional patterns, then disappearing abruptly. 2 separate radar installations confirmed them. Visual sightings across the city. Jets were scrambled. One pilot reported being surrounded. The men around the table leaned forward. A lieutenant spoke next, flipping to a new slide showing civilian reports. These aren't just military accounts. Civilians saw the lights too. Pilots, policemen, reporters. This isn't a single source anomaly. General Samford folded his hands slowly, and the room fell silent for a moment. The lieutenant cleared his throat. "Sir, the press already knows. It's on the front page of every morning paper." The general sighed. He had expected this, but he had hoped quietly that maybe the story would stay small, contained. That hope vanished now. By mid-morning, the Pentagon was receiving calls at a pace that exceeded many wartime operations. Reporters wanted statements. Senators wanted explanations. Base commanders wanted guidance. And the White House wanted reassurance. Officers stood in hallways with telephones pressed to their ears, scribbling notes, exchanging urgent glances, and passing folders back and forth. The phrase "flying saucers" echoed through the building, often that morning, sometimes with irritation, sometimes with disbelief, and occasionally, in quieter tones, with genuine concern. A young intelligence analyst, who had only been at the Pentagon for 6 months, whispered to a colleague as they passed in the corridor, "Do you ever get the feeling we re-witnessing something we, Dante, have the tools to understand?" Her colleague gave a tight smile. Every hour. By noon, the Pentagon press office had reached its limit. Phones rang non-stop. Secretaries hurried between offices. Reporters were gathering outside the building gates, demanding clarification. Inside, officers debated the official line. Should they emphasize national security, downplay the sightings, acknowledge the possibility of unknown technology, or simply tell the public as little as possible? General Samford finally spoke, his voice calm but decisive. "We tell them the truth, as much of it as we understand. No speculation, no panic, just facts." It was a reasonable approach, but given how little was actually known, facts proved surprisingly elusive. By early afternoon, the Pentagon had organized what would become one of the largest press briefings in U.S. military history. Technicians prepared the briefing room. Microphones were tested and retested. Rows of chairs were laid out for reporters, beginning to gather outside the doors. General Samford reviewed his notes in silence. Beside him, Major Dewey Fournette, a key figure in the Air Force's UFO investigations, compiled technical summaries for the general to reference. Both men were professionals. Both were accustomed to pressure, but neither had ever stood before the press to discuss phenomena that defied explanation. Outside the door, the murmur of reporters grew louder. Cameras clicked as photographers tested their equipment. A sense of anticipation filled the air. It was clear that whatever happened in that room would shape public perception of the events for decades to come. At precisely 4 p.m., the doors opened. General Samford stepped to the podium, adjusting his uniform with deliberate care. Flashbulbs flared as dozens of journalists lifted their cameras. He began with a slow, steady breath. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are here today to discuss recent unidentified aerial phenomena reported over Washington, D.C." The room fell silent. He spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision, making sure not to inflame speculation. "The Air Force has been investigating these events thoroughly. We have no evidence of hostile intent, no indication that the objects pose a threat." He paused as a hand shot up in the crowd. "General, are these objects aircraft, foreign, domestic?" General Samford shook his head slightly. "At this time, we cannot confirm their nature." Another reporter raised his voice. "Are you ruling out extraterrestrial involvement?" A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the room. Samford's response was calm, almost gentle. "The Air Force is not prepared to speculate on extraterrestrial origins." His tone conveyed reassurance, but the lack of a definitive answer left the room buzzing. Toward the end of the briefing, Samford offered a theory that many believed would settle public unease: the idea of temperature inversions, a rare meteorological phenomenon known to cause unusual radar reflections. Weather conditions may have contributed to false radar returns, he explained. These atmospheric effects can be misleading. Some reporters nodded. Others exchanged skeptical glances. A few scribbled temperature inversion into their notebooks with question marks that suggested doubt rather than acceptance. Samford concluded with a final, measured statement. "We are continuing to investigate, but we see no reason for alarm." The cameras clicked once more. The press conference ended. And yet, the uncertainty remained. Once the reporters had left and the microphones were turned off, a different conversation began. The same officers who had stood confidently before the public retreated into private rooms with drawn blinds and heavy files spread across tables. Charts and radar logs were reviewed again. Pilot transcripts were replayed. Civilian reports were compared for consistency. And slowly, a new realization formed. The temperature inversion explanation might soften public concern, but it did not fully explain what happened. One officer spoke quietly. "Sir, inversions don't accelerate, don't change altitude, and don't surround jets." Another added, "And they don't show up visually over the Capitol building." A hush fell over the room. The unspoken truth hovered in the air. Something had been in the sky, something real, something intelligent. And the Pentagon still had no idea what it was. Outside the Pentagon, Washington drifted into the evening with a strange mix of anxiety and fascination. Newspapers hit the stands with bold headlines. Lights return over Capitol. Air Force scrambles jets again. What is happening in our skies? Families discussed the sightings over dinner. Taxi drivers exchanged stories. Politicians whispered in corridors. And children, staring up at the darkening sky, wondered if the lights might appear again. For many, the events had an almost dreamlike quality, something unbelievable, and yet witnessed by so many that belief became unavoidable. The city felt different now, more attentive, more alert, more aware of the vastness above. As the city settled into sleep, the Pentagon did not. Lights stayed on in key offices late into the night. Analysts reviewed data. Meteorologists provided updated atmospheric readings. Radio operators logged every unusual signal. General Samford paced slowly along a long hallway, hands clasped behind his back. Officers approached him with questions, files, and updates. But despite the flurry of activity, a quietness filled the air. Not panic, but a sober recognition that the situation required patience, clarity, and steady leadership. The Pentagon was on alert, not for war, not for invasion, but for understanding. As midnight approached, a final meeting was held in a secure room with only a handful of senior officers present. The conversation was short but serious. "We cannot afford another surprise. We need continuous radar coverage and immediate response protocols." The decision was unanimous. Pilots would be kept on standby, and all unusual aerial activity would be logged and analyzed with unprecedented precision. For the first time since the events began, there was a plan, imperfect, incomplete, but undeniably present, a path forward. When General Samford finally left the building in the early morning hours, the sky above Washington was calm. No glowing spheres hovering over the river, only stars, distant, silent, and ancient, watching over the sleeping city. He paused for a moment on the steps, gazing upward. The night felt vast, mysterious, peaceful, and somewhere in that stillness he sensed a truth he couldn't quite put into words, that perhaps the panic wasn't a reaction to danger, but to wonder, to possibility, to the realization that humanity, for all its knowledge and power, had only touched a small corner of the universe. He exhaled slowly and walked to his waiting car. The Pentagon dimmed behind him. Washington slept, and the sky, quiet now, held its secrets close for the moment. Night fell slowly over Washington that Sunday, as if the sky itself were tired from the long hours of sunlight. The warm air softened into a gentle evening breeze that moved quietly through the city's streets, stirring leaves, ruffling curtains, and carrying with it the faint scent of summer rain that never quite arrived. It was the kind of night when the world usually began to settle, when the city exhaled and prepared for another Monday. But this night felt different. There was a stillness in the air that wasn't quite calm, a hushed expectancy that seemed to drift through neighborhoods and linger over rooftops. The nation's capital, usually so composed and orderly, felt unusually alert, as though it had one eye open, waiting. People didn't sleep easily that night, not because of fear, not because danger was looming, but because something extraordinary had brushed against the edges of ordinary life, and the mind does not return to routine quickly after such things. Washington was awake, quietly, thoughtfully, restlessly awake. On narrow residential streets, where row houses stood shoulder to shoulder, porch lights glowed softly. A few families lingered on their front steps long after dinner plates had been washed and radios had been turned off. A man in a short-sleeved shirt leaned against his railing, squinting up at the sky, as though hoping the mysterious lights might drift overhead again. Beside him, a neighbor sipped tea from a mug, speaking in a low voice so as not to disturb the crickets. In another home, a woman stood at her window with the curtain pulled aside, watching the distant silhouette of the Washington Monument. She wasn't expecting anything dramatic, no bright streaks, no silent orbs, like the ones she'd read about in the morning paper. She simply wanted to see the city, to look at it with new awareness, knowing that something had visited the quiet sky the night before. Across town, a taxi driver leaned on his car beneath a street lamp, listening to chatter from his dispatch radio. Most nights, the radio filled with calls about pickups and drop-offs, lost bags, or passengers left behind at diners. But tonight, even the dispatchers seemed contemplative. Their voices were slower, softer. Any sign of more lights? One driver asked another through the static. None so far, came the reply. But it's a strange feeling, isn't it? Like the sky's watching us. The first driver chuckled lightly. Let it watch. It's quieter than most fares I get. And the conversation drifted back to silence, leaving only the hum of the city. Down by the Potomac River, where the water often held the moonlight like a sheet of quiet silver, several people walked along the riverbanks, hands in pockets, thoughts adrift. Couples strolled without speaking much, their footsteps soft against the path. Joggers moved at an unhurried pace. A few young men sat on the low stone wall, overlooking the water, legs dangling, whispering about the sightings they'd heard from the radio. The river itself seemed unusually still, as though listening. The reflections of the monuments shimmered faintly, the Lincoln Memorial glowing like a warm lantern, the Washington Monument rising like a pale, slender shadow, and the distant dome of the Capitol softening in the night haze. Somewhere above the river, perhaps miles up, or perhaps nowhere at all, radar screens had once tracked impossible movements, lights that slipped forward and back, hovering without wings, gliding with purpose, yet without sound. Even though the sky was empty now, the river carried the memory of those things in the way it held its breath, long and slow. While the city wandered through its own restlessness, another kind of sleeplessness hummed behind locked doors at military and civilian radar stations. Inside National Airport's control tower, the night shift had settled in. Coffee cups rested on metal desks. The glow of radar screens painted the room in soft greens and shadows. The controllers spoke in gentle tones, their voices floating through the room like the steady flow of a stream. One controller, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and the habitual calm of someone used to responsibility, leaned toward his console, watching the sweep of the radar beam trace its endless circle. Nothing unusual appeared. No sudden jumps, no darting blips, no unexplainable halos on the screen. But even so, he felt a subtle tension, the kind that came not from fear, but from anticipation. He took a slow breath, feeling the cool metal of the chair beneath him. He had seen the lights a week before, watched them flicker onto the radar with unmistakable clarity. He knew how real it had been. Beside him, a younger technician scribbled in a notebook, recording each sweep of the radar as protocol required for the heightened alert. "Quiet tonight," the technician murmured. "For now," the older man answered, almost gently. "But quiet's not a bad thing." They shared a small smile, the kind that comes from long hours spent in the same dim room. In another radar center, across the river at Andrews Air Force Base, the atmosphere mirrored that calm. Fans hummed, machines clicked rhythmically. Airmen leaned over consoles with a quiet professionalism, doing their work with steady hands despite the extraordinary nature of the previous night. The things they had seen, whatever they were, had moved with intention, direction, and a kind of grace. There had been no chaos in their motion, no threat in their presence, just mystery. And so the men worked with a careful attentiveness, ready but not afraid. In a darkened hangar at Andrews Air Force Base, 2 jet interceptors rested beneath overhead lamps, their silver bodies gleaming faintly like mirrors catching starlight. The pilots assigned to them sat nearby in a small ready room, boots propped on tables, chairs tilted back, flight suits half-sipped. The atmosphere wasn't tense, it was contemplative. One of the pilots, a tall man with a calm face and hands that never seemed to shake, leaned back with a newspaper on his lap. The headline read, "Mysterious Lights Return to Washington Skies." He sighed softly, then folded the paper. "You think we'll see them again tonight?" asked the pilot beside him, tapping a pencil lightly against his notebook. The first pilot shook his head with a small smile. "No idea, but if we do, I hope they're as gentle as last time." The second man nodded thoughtfully. "They didn't move like anything hostile," he said quietly, "more like, I don't know, scouts, observers, or travelers." The first suggested, almost dreaming aloud. "Yeah, travelers." The word lingered in the room, carrying with it the image of far-off places, unknown skies, and beings drifting peacefully through the night. Back in the heart of Washington, streetcars rattled along their tracks, newspapers rustled under porch lights, radios murmured softly in bedrooms where people lay awake, not jittery but thoughtful. The news stations offered calm voices, discussing theories with measured restraint, temperature inversions, radar malfunctions, distant aircraft. None of the explanations felt entirely right, yet none brought panic either. Somewhere on the far edge of the city, a small diner remained open through the night. The neon sign buzzed softly. Inside, a few people sat at the counter, sipping coffee or stirring sugar into late-night cups. A tired reporter scribbled notes into a small pad. A long-haul bus driver rested his elbows on the counter, talking quietly with the waitress. A university student stared dreamily out the window, chin resting in her hand. They weren't discussing fear. They weren't discussing danger. They were discussing possibility. "Do you think they'll come back?" the waitress asked softly. The reporter shrugged. "Hard to say, but whatever they were, they didn't seem unfriendly." The bus driver nodded. "Didn't feel like an invasion, more like someone passing through," and the conversation dissolved into the gentle clatter of dishes. Washington was a city accustomed to power, order, and precision. It was a city that ran on schedules and briefings, on certainty and control. But the events of July had given it something rare, something that broke through the routines and regulations. A moment of wonder, a reason to look up, a reminder that, for all its importance on Earth, Washington was still small beneath the vast night sky. People lying in bed found themselves gazing toward their windows, listening to the soft hum of their electric fans, feeling the warm summer air move across their blankets. Thoughts drifted loosely, not focused, not troubled, just wandering. What were the lights? Where had they come from? Would they return? And if they did, would the sky glow once more with that pale, drifting radiance? The questions lulled many into sleep, the mystery becoming a kind of lullaby. Sometime after 3 a.m., the last pockets of wakefulness began to fade. The porch lights clicked off one by one. Radios grew quiet. Curtains fell closed. The crickets took over the soundscape, chirping rhythmically beneath the canopy of summer leaves. The Potomac glimmered softly, mirroring a sky finally at peace. And Washington, sleepless and thoughtful, finally began to rest. It rested with a sense of connection to the vast and gentle unknown, as though something had touched the edges of human understanding and left behind not fear, but wonder, a wonder that stretched into the closing hours of the night, a wonder that would remain long after the lights faded from the sky, a wonder that made the city feel just a little more alive, even in sleep. The sun rose slowly over Washington on July 29, 1952, bathing the city in a soft, honey-gold light. Early morning haze drifted above the Potomac like a thin veil, warming gradually as the day awakened. Even after a week of strange lights, unexpected radar contacts, and sleepless nights, the capital felt strangely peaceful in the tender hours of dawn. Birds chirped. Street vendors set up their carts. Newspapers landed with familiar thumps on townhouse doorsteps. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, the city was holding its breath. Inside the Pentagon, word had spread quickly. The government would be holding a formal press conference, the largest the Air Force had ever arranged for a single, unexplained event. 4 days, reporters had been gathering rumors from radar officers, pilots, and anonymous sources who insisted the objects were real. That morning, they lined up outside military press headquarters before the doors even opened, clutching notebooks and flashbulbs with a kind of eager exhaustion. The air buzzed with restless speculation. Some whispered that secret weapons were responsible. Others insisted it had to be hostile aircraft from far across the world. And some, more soft-spoken, perhaps hopeful, wondered if the glowing lights were visitors from someplace far beyond Earth. Whatever the truth was, everyone sensed one thing: something unusual had happened, and it was time for answers. In the main conference room, rows of chairs filled quickly. The atmosphere was warm and crowded, jackets draped over chairbacks, cigarette smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling, reporters shifting in their seats as the tension grew. Fans hummed in the corners, circulating thick July air that smelled faintly of ink, coffee, and the faint metallic temps of equipment warming under bright lights. At the front of the room stood a long wooden table, pitchers of water, several microphones, and soon the two men chosen to address the nation. Major General John Samford, the Air Force's Director of Intelligence, known for his calm and deliberate manner, and beside him, Major Dewey Fournette, the Pentagon's liaison for UFO investigations, quiet and sharp-eyed. Each detail seemed to confirm that something extraordinary had passed over the capital that month, something real enough to spark concern, yet mysterious enough to unsettle even seasoned military eyes. But as he continued, he emphasized one phrase with familiar military steadiness. There is no evidence that these objects pose a threat to national security. A soft wave rippled through the room, relief for some, frustration for others. It was an answer, but also not an answer. He went on to suggest possible explanations: temperature inversions, radar mirages, misidentified aircraft. Words meant to ground the moment, to bring the extraordinary back into the realm of the explainable. Yet every so often, a reporter leaned to whisper to another, puzzled. The descriptions didn't quite match the accounts from the radar rooms. They didn't completely fit the pilot's testimony. The lights had moved with purpose. They had changed direction. They had accelerated. It wasn't hostility that puzzled the public. It was the precision. Major Dewey Fournette spoke next. He addressed patterns of motion recorded by radar and pilot sightings. He described how the objects had turned sharply, sped away rapidly, and grouped in formations. He was technical in his delivery, measured and neutral. But his words carried a subtle undertone, something that suggested he, too, found the behavior unusual. He did not say outright what he believed, but listeners could sense his careful curiosity, his cautious respect for the unknown. Reporters raised hands. Some questions were calm, others tinged with urgency. General, are these foreign aircraft? Could they be experimental? Are these objects under intelligent control? And if so, whose intelligence? Samford responded with patience. We have no evidence to suggest these sightings are of any foreign origin, he repeated, and we have found no indication that they represent a controlled threat to the United States. But that last question lingered in the air like a quiet echo. Were they under control? Samford chose his words with the precision of a man navigating a tightrope. There are things in the sky, he said slowly, which we do not fully understand. The room held its breath. We have always believed, he continued, that the American people deserve the truth about matters of national interest. At the same time, we must be cautious not to draw conclusions without proper evidence. It was an answer meant to soothe, yet it kept the doorway to wonder open just a little. For nearly 2 hours, the press conference continued. It was the longest UFO-related briefing in U.S. history, and to this day remains one of the most unusual. Through every explanation offered, whether temperature, layers, atmospheric illusions, a subtle thread hung beneath the surface, the acknowledgement that not everything had been fully explained. When the final questions faded and the bright lights dimmed, General Samford stood, straightened his jacket, and offered a final thought. "The skies have always held mysteries," he said gently, "but we continue to watch them, and we remain dedicated to understanding them." With that, the conference concluded. Reporters filed out into the hallway, their conversations excited but quiet, as though reluctant to break the atmosphere of mystery that lingered behind those doors. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement, and the air felt strangely still, as though the city itself was absorbing the words that had been spoken. Across Washington, millions listened to the story unfold on radios and evening broadcasts. Some felt reassured, others felt more curious than ever. Families discussed the lights over dinner tables. Taxi drivers brought it up in casual conversation. Scientists debated. Children pointed at stars with new fascination. But as night settled once again over the capital, something else happened. The city grew quiet. The alarms faded. The jets remained grounded. No glowing orbs flickered over the monuments. Washington seemed to relax for the first time in days. Yet, for those who had been awake through the tense July nights, radar operators, pilots, sleepless residents, a sense of soft wonder remained. The skies had carried visitors of some kind, perhaps only weather, perhaps only illusions, or perhaps something more poetic, something not yet understood. And with the world now watching, the city, once filled with tension, drifted into a rare kind of peaceful reflection. Lights in townhouses dimmed one by one. Radios clicked off. Window blinds lowered gently. And the night wrapped itself around Washington with a quiet, velvety stillness. Above the city, the stars shimmered, calm, distant, and beautiful. Whatever the truth of those summer nights had been, the sky did what it had always done, watched patiently, held its secrets, and lulled the restless world into sleep. In the quiet days that followed the press conference, Washington felt like a city exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The nights grew softer again. The constant drone of jets faded back into the familiar hum of distant traffic. And though the memories of strange lights and restless evenings lingered, the capital settled into a gentle rhythm, almost as if the sky had agreed to give everyone a little time to rest. But while the city tried to return to normal, the rest of the world had just begun to process what had happened. Across the country, newspapers filled their front pages with headlines speaking of mysterious lights, radar anomalies, and Air Force explanations. Coffee shops buzzed with quiet speculation. Families gathered around dinner tables, passing mashed potatoes and theories in equal measure. And in small midnight living rooms, illuminated by the soft glow of tube televisions, people replayed the statements from the Pentagon press conference, wondering which parts were answers and which were carefully delivered reassurance. Theories grew like flowers after rain, some familiar, some far-fetched, some tender and imaginative. Meteorologists stepped forward first, offering gentle, scientific explanations. They spoke of temperature inversions, of warm air layers resting gently above cool ones, bending radar waves like light through a shimmering desert horizon. It was a comforting explanation, almost poetic nature itself playing tricks on the technology humans relied on. But radar operators who had been there shook their heads politely. Temperature inversions, they said, did not normally accelerate, did not change direction, and certainly did not pace jets across the sky. Then came the aviation experts, quietly proposing that misidentified aircraft might have created the illusion of coordinated movement. But even they admitted that no known aircraft, domestic or foreign, could hover one moment, then dart away faster than anything seen at the time. Military analysts added their own thoughts, some carefully guarded. Could the glowing spheres have been some new technology, a foreign prototype, a secret domestic project? Possibilities, perhaps, yet no one offered details, and the silence beneath the speculation whispered its own kind of mystery. Scientists in universities spoke thoughtfully on radio broadcasts, their voices warm and calm. Some suggested plasma phenomena, like ball lightning or atmospheric electricity. Others claimed that the lights could have been celestial objects misread by tired eyes at midnight. These explanations soothed some listeners, though they didn't quite match the accounts from trained pilots, nor the precise patterns recorded on radar screens. But one group, the quiet observers, the curious dreamers, looked at the sky with gentler eyes. They wondered if the lights might be something else entirely, something not hostile, not threatening, just unfamiliar. People didn't say the word outright, not in serious conversations, but they hinted around it in the soft way humans do when they speak of something wondrous but fragile, a possibility, a whisper. The idea that perhaps humanity had been visited by travelers, not from another nation, but from another corner of the vast, starlit universe. Of course, no one claimed certainty. Not then, not now. But imagination has always been one of the quiet engines of human curiosity. And yet, as these theories blossomed and spread, the Air Force maintained a careful silence. They released small, formal statements, polite acknowledgments that further analysis would continue, that the situation was under review, that no definitive explanation had been confirmed. Their words were calm, responsible, and cautious, but with every passing day, the tone suggested something gentle. This chapter might quietly close, with or without an answer. Behind closed doors, Project Blue Book analysts sifted through reports. They cataloged transcripts. They interviewed witnesses and radar specialists. Their files filled quickly, pages upon pages describing glowing lights, rapid maneuvers, and sightings across multiple nights. Many explanations were offered. Some cases were marked solved, but others remained quietly labeled unidentified. Still, no dramatic announcements followed. No alarm bells rang. The nation moved on, not because it forgot, but because life has a way of guiding people back toward their routines, their families, their daily rhythms. As summer drifted toward autumn, the heat softened. Mornings felt cooler, tinged with the earthy scent of approaching fall. The nights grew longer and darker, ideal for stargazing. Though most residents of Washington now looked up with a softer, more contemplative curiosity than before. The city that had once buzzed with fear now held a peaceful reverence toward the sky. Children who had caught glimpses of the strange lights told stories in hushed, excited whispers. Parents listened, half smiling, half wondering. Elderly neighbors recalled the days of early aviation, marveling at how far human flight had come, and how far it still might go. But perhaps the most notable change was the silence. After the sightings, after the jets, After the press conference that flowed across every radio station in America, the skies over Washington remained calm. No strange blips, no darting orbs, no glowing symbols drifting over the Capitol dome. It was as if the events of July had been a fleeting breath, a momentary ripple on the surface of an otherwise still pond. Yet, even in the calm, the question remained like a gentle echo. Why had they come? Why those nights? Why Washington? And why? So silently, the theories continued, of course. Some said it had been a test, not of weaponry, but of humanity's response. Others suggested that whatever the objects were, they were observing something, gathering information the way scientists observe distant galaxies or migrating animals. But the simplest theory also became the most comforting. Maybe the lights had no agenda at all. Maybe they were just passing by travelers on a long journey, pausing for a moment above a glowing capital city before drifting on to someplace else. And so, as summer faded into memory, Washington entered a gentle détente with the unknown. Life resumed. Offices bustled. Monuments stood serene. The Potomac shimmered beneath morning sunlight. And at night, the stars continued their silent stories. The silence was not the silence of dismissal or forgetting. It was the silence of acceptance, the kind that acknowledges that some mysteries do not need urgent answers. Some mysteries can simply be appreciated, held gently, watched with wonder. In bedrooms across the city, people drifted to sleep beneath calm skies. The memory of the lights became something almost dreamlike, strange but beautiful, puzzling but peaceful. A reminder that the universe was wider than anyone truly grasped, and that humanity's place within it was still unfolding like a vast, ancient story. And so the silence endured, not empty, but full of possibility. Above Washington, the night sky remained serene and endless, watching over a city that had looked upward in fear, and had ultimately found curiosity instead. In the quiet weeks that followed the sightings, as summer drifted toward its gentle late-season stillness, a different kind of work began, not in the skies, not in the control towers, but deep inside the quiet, windowless rooms where the nation stored its memories. Government buildings in Washington have a particular way of settling into silence after dark. Footsteps fade. Elevators hum softly before resting for the night. Long corridors, polished by years of shoes, hold on to the day's warmth, and somewhere beneath these calm hallways, behind ordinary doors with small brass numbers, the country keeps its archives, a labyrinth of papers, reels, reports, and records, neatly stacked and stored like a sleeping library. It was there, in those cool, softly lit rooms, that the quietest chapter of the Washington sightings took place. Project Blue Book, charged with reviewing reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, began receiving a gentle cascade of documents. Radar logs, pilot testimonies, photographs, scribbled notes made hurriedly during long, drowsy nights in the summer heat. The files came in cardboard boxes and manila envelopes, tied with string or clipped together by rust-colored metal fasteners. When the analysts spoke, they did so in calm, measured tones. No one raised their voice. No one expressed alarm. Other times, they nodded absently, as though acknowledging something familiar, yet still elusive. But there were no breakthroughs, no sudden moments of revelation, only the steady, quiet accumulation of details, like tiny grains of sand, slowly shaping the shoreline of understanding. The archives themselves seemed to breathe with the work. The air was cool and faintly dusty, carrying the scent of old paper and aged cardboard. Light bulbs hummed overhead. Ventilation units whispered through metal grates. Occasionally, a drawer slid open, releasing a faint metallic sigh. Even these soft sounds contributed to the atmosphere, steady, almost hypnotic, as though the building itself was watching over the process. And every now and then, when the sun dipped low and the golden light filtered through the high windows, a kind of reflective calm washed over the room. The analysts sat in that warm glow, glancing toward the faint sliver of sky visible beyond the glass. The sky that had caused so much wonder, so many questions. The sky that still held its silence. Among the files, one collection stood out, a thick folder filled with statements from radar operators who had been on duty during the first night of sightings. Their accounts were steady and professional, yet tinged with the awe they had felt. They described the blips that moved with purpose, then paused, then darted away faster than any aircraft they knew. They described multiple radar stations confirming the same targets, and they described their own quiet astonishment as the patterns repeated again and again, like a strange form of communication written across the sky. The analysts reading these testimonies didn't dismiss them. They didn't amplify them either. They simply noted each detail, aware that behind every line was a human being who had watched something unusual unfold in real time. Another set of files contained transcripts of communications between jet pilots and ground controllers. The voices were calm, almost serene, no panic, no urgency, just the steady cadence of aviators describing something they couldn't quite explain. Lights that glowed softly, moved gracefully, then vanished without a trace. The analysts listened to those recordings through heavy headphones, the audio crackling softly. The pilot's words drifted through the static-like voices carried on a distant wind. Every sentence became another thread in the tapestry the team was trying to weave. But each thread, no matter how detailed, remained only part of the larger picture. Even when the analysts held all the reports in their hands, dozens of pages, diagrams, logs, letters, they understood something gently humbling. The complete explanation was still beyond reach. And yet there was comfort in the investigation, a quiet reassurance in knowing that the phenomenon had been studied carefully, respectfully, and without haste. No one rushed to judgment. No one forced a simple answer onto a complicated event. Instead, the analysts allowed the mystery to remain intact, like a softly glowing lantern in a darkened room. Some nights, when the office grew still and the analysts finally packed up to head home, a few lingered by the windows. The sky outside was often clear, a smooth, deep navy canvas brushed with stars, the same stars that had watched over the city during those July nights, the same stars that had witnessed the glowing shapes drifting above the monuments. Standing there, looking upward, the analysts sometimes felt a sense of connection, as though the work they did in these quiet rooms was part of a much older, broader tradition. Humans have always looked to the sky, always wondered, always sought meaning in the movements of light across the heavens. Their files were just another chapter in that long story. And so the work continued, even as the urgency faded. The summer heat softened. Autumn leaves rustled across the National Mall, and inside the cool, quiet archives, the reports from the Washington sightings found their place, not as answers, but as questions carefully preserved for those who might one day seek them. Some documents received official labels: temperature inversion, optical effects, radar reflection. Others received a more delicate classification: unidentified. But even that label was gentle, not alarming, not ominous, simply an acknowledgement that not all mysteries yield their secrets right away. As winter approached, the analysts boxed up the files, tying each bundle with a thin cotton string. The boxes were placed on shelves alongside thousands of others, each one holding its own small piece of history. And there, in the quiet of the archives, the story of the Washington UFO invasion rested, not forgotten, not dismissed, simply waiting like a lullaby stored in a wooden chest, ready to be rediscovered someday. Above them, outside the thick concrete walls, the sky remained wide and silent, dusted with stars. And in that silence, the memory of those shimmering lights lingered, soft, peaceful, and endlessly mysterious. Long after the files had been boxed and tucked away in the quiet government archives, the memory of that summer lived on, not in official statements or technical analyses. For many who experienced those July nights, the Washington sightings became woven into the tapestry of their lives, a small but luminous thread that added a touch of wonder to their history. Some of those voices, years later, spoke softly of their experiences. There was a former radar operator named Russell, who had been young then, barely in his 20s. He spent that first July night in a dimly lit control room at National Airport, surrounded by the familiar hum of the radar consoles. Even decades later, when asked about that night, his eyes would take on a distant, thoughtful shine. And then there was Henry, an airline pilot who had been on approach to Washington that same night. He flew a quiet, disciplined path, the city lights twinkling below, when he noticed the softly glowing shapes pacing the aircraft from a distance. By the time he was an older man, decades removed from his time in the cockpit, Henry spoke of that night with the same gentle awe he had felt in the moment. It felt, he said once, as though the sky had guests, not invaders, not enemies, just visitors, curious, drifting, watching. He remembered the passengers sleeping peacefully behind him, oblivious to the quiet dance unfolding beyond the windows. He remembered the way the lights moved, gliding, then pausing, then drifting away into the dark like lanterns carried by an invisible breeze. "People think it must have been frightening," he said softly, "but it wasn't. It felt like being in the presence of something graceful." One evening, long after he'd retired, Henry watched a meteor shower with his grandchildren. As streaks of silver crossed the night sky, he found himself thinking back to those summer nights in 1952. He didn't tell the children the whole story, just smiled and told them the sky is full of surprises. Always keep looking up. Another voice came from a woman named Margaret, who had been a young reporter at the time. She covered the stirrings of public curiosity after the sightings. Her memories were less about the strange lights themselves, she hadn't seen them firsthand, and more about the feeling that washed over the city in the days that followed. She recalled the way people gathered on their porches after sunset, eyes tilted upward, as though hoping for one more glimpse of something unexplained. It was the most communal moment I'd ever seen, she remembered. Margaret kept her notes from that time tucked away in a drawer, yellowed pages filled with neatly typed lines. Interviews with pilots, radar operators, and ordinary citizens who had caught a glimpse of glowing shapes drifting above the monuments. "They remind me," she said once, "that mystery can bring people together just as strongly as certainty can." There was also a park ranger named Lewis who had been stationed near the Washington Monument during the second wave of sightings. He often worked quiet night shifts, walking the grounds, keeping watch over the tall obelisk that pierced the sky like a pale, silent sentinel. On one of those July nights, as he made his usual rounds, he saw a soft light drifting above the mall, not bright, not flashing, just glowing steadily like a floating ember. He watched it for several minutes, listening to the gentle rustle of summer grass and the distant hum of traffic. "It didn't behave like anything I'd ever seen," he said later, "but it didn't seem dangerous. It felt thoughtful, like it was exploring the world slowly, the way someone might wander through a museum, taking in the sights." Years later, long after he'd retired, he would still walk the mall at dusk, smiling at the play of light across the Potomac. "I don't know what it was," he would say, "but it made me appreciate how much beauty there is in the unknown." Some memories came not from those who saw the lights themselves, but from those who lived through the atmosphere of the time. Children who stayed awake past their bedtime, hoping to catch a glimpse of something magical. Taxi drivers who heard passengers share stories in hushed voices. Hotel clerks who listened to excited whispers in lobbies filled with summer heat. and the faint scent of polished floors. Those voices spoke of a city wrapped in gentle wonder, not fear, not suspicion, but a soft curiosity that made even the most ordinary evenings feel touched by the extraordinary. Even decades later, when the events had been tucked into history books, and the official explanations had been neatly placed on record, those personal stories continued to glow, small, steady embers of memory. They weren't dramatic, they weren't definitive, but together they formed a constellation of human experience, each point of light revealing another angle of that mysterious summer. When these voices were gathered not in archives, but in the hearts of those who lived through the moment, they created something softer and more meaningful than any technical report. They created a shared memory, a memory of warm midsummer nights when the sky above Washington held something unusual, something graceful, something that slipped quietly through the clouds and left behind a shimmer of wonder. For the people who remembered, the question of what those lights were mattered far less than the feeling they evoked. That rare sense of being part of something larger, something that invited reflection rather than alarm. And so, as the years passed, the voices that remembered spoke less about the mystery itself and more about what it meant to them, the calm, the curiosity, the sense of unity that settled over the city like a warm, gentle breeze. It became clear, listening to them, that the legacy of those nights was not found in radar readings or official statements. It lived in the quiet hearts of the people who watched the sky that summer and felt, if only for a moment, the presence of something beyond the familiar, something that whispered of possibility, something that invited wonder, something that made the world feel wider, softer, and deeply connected beneath the vast canopy of stars. After the bright flashes and the distant hum of jets had faded, and after the press conferences and the careful explanations had settled over the city like soft curtains, life in Washington began to resume its familiar rhythms. Streets grew quiet in the early mornings. Coffee shops opened with the aroma of fresh brewing, and the Potomac flowed in its steady, unhurried path beneath bridges that had seen decades of history. Yet beneath this calm surface, the city had changed, subtly, gently, in ways only the human heart could perceive. Everywhere, people carried the memory of those midsummer nights. The radar operators who had spent long hours tracking mysterious blips still recalled the soft hum of consoles and the quiet glow of the screens. In hushed moments, they would describe the movement of those objects, precise, fluid, unthreatening, and the strange thrill of knowing that they were witnessing something not easily explained. Though their days returned to routine, a private wonder lingered behind their measured professional demeanor. Pilots, too, carried their own quiet reverence. They spoke of the soft lights drifting alongside their aircraft, moving with grace as though testing the boundaries of the sky without challenging them. Some pilots found themselves glancing upward in other cities, long after the events, half expecting to see a familiar shimmer in the distance. Others smiled privately when recounting the nights, remembering the patience and calm required as they followed those lights, a patience the world outside might never understand. But the human experience of the sightings extended far beyond the professionals who had seen the objects firsthand. Civilians, too, had felt the gentle tug of curiosity, awe, and communal wonder. Families gathered on porches, wrapped in blankets, the air filled with the distant sounds of cicadas and hum of the city. Conversations flowed softly between neighbors who might otherwise have remained strangers. each sharing what they had glimpsed, each leaning into the unspoken acknowledgement that the world can hold more than the mind often believes. Children who had stayed up late to watch the skies added their own light to the memory of those nights. They traced invisible patterns with small fingers, pointing at nothing in particular, their imaginations filling in the spaces between stars. For them, the lights were not a puzzle to solve or a threat to fear, but a magical presence, a whispered story that made the universe feel larger and kinder than it seemed during the day. Journalists remembered the quiet excitement that had drifted over newsrooms. They had typed stories under warm lamplight, carefully balancing fact with curiosity, ensuring their words carried both truth and a sense of wonder. Their typewriters clicked in steady rhythms late into the night, filling the offices with sound and purpose. Even years later, the clatter of keys and the smell of ink seemed to connect them to that moment, a moment when the world paused and looked upward together. In offices within the Pentagon and across military bases, the quieter human side of the story unfolded as well. Analysts, scientists, and officers who had tracked the events through radar readings and pilot reports often reflected on what it meant to be a small part of something larger. They shared stories over coffee breaks, trading observations about the patterns, the precision, and the grace of the lights. Though the events were classified in reports and documents, the personal understanding of those who had been awake through long nights became a soft thread connecting the people involved, a shared experience that transcended rank, training, and position. Even the Air Force officials at the press conference carried their own human stories. Standing before the nation, they had measured every word, aware that they were guiding public perception without revealing the unknown entirely. Behind the polished statements and careful phrasing, they too had watched the skies with curiosity, felt their hearts quicken when radar returns defied explanation, and considered the vast possibilities of what lay beyond human comprehension. Their calm professionalism was underpinned by genuine human wonder, a secret, quiet appreciation that the world contains things yet to be understood. The city itself seemed to acknowledge this collective humanity. Monuments and memorials, silent and timeless, held the memory of those nights in their stone and marble. The Capitol dome reflected moonlight like a soft sentinel. The Potomac mirrored the sky, offering a gentle reminder that some mysteries belong both to the heavens and to the human imagination. And in parks and quiet streets, the people of Washington continued to carry the gentle awe of those summer nights, long after the lights had disappeared. Stories of the events traveled gently over time, growing softer, more reflective. Each person remembered in their own way. A retired operator might recall the hum of radar consoles, a pilot the slow glide of luminous orbs, a mother the hush of her children pointing skyward, a journalist the delicate balance between reporting and wonder. These recollections were not dramatic, not urgent, but deeply human, snapshots of curiosity, patience, and quiet awe. And when these individual memories intersected, a larger tapestry emerged, one that did not rely on explanation or proof, but on the subtle connections between all those who had looked up that summer night. It was a tapestry woven from human experience, eyes raised, hearts open, minds gently stretched toward the unknown. It was about shared humanity and the capacity for wonder that exists in each person, whether they are operating a radar console, piloting an aircraft, writing in a dim office, or gazing skyward from a quiet street. In the quiet that followed the sightings, the city itself seemed to exhale. People found their rhythm again. Children slept beneath starry skies. Streets and sidewalks returned to their usual patterns. The Potomac flowed steadily, and the monuments rested under moonlight. And yet, in every heart, the memory of those soft, glowing lights lingered, a gentle, enduring reminder that life can hold unexpected beauty, that mystery is part of the human experience, and that looking up can connect us all in subtle, quiet ways. Even decades later, those who had lived through the 1952 events remembered not just the lights themselves, but the people beside them, the shared curiosity, the subtle sense that the world was larger than daily routine. And in that shared recollection, a quiet truth emerged. Humanity's fascination with the unknown is not rooted in fear, but in a gentle, universal yearning to understand, to wonder, and to connect. And so, as Washington settled once again into the rhythms of ordinary life, the human side of the story endured. In offices and homes, in parks and quiet streets, in the hearts of all who had witnessed, reflected, or simply imagined those nights, a calm thread of connection remained, a reminder that the world is vast, mysterious, and endlessly filled with moments of shared awe. Above it all, the sky watched silently, and beneath it, the city slept, peaceful, reflective, and quietly bonded by the memory of midsummer nights when the unknown drifted gracefully overhead, leaving only wonder in its wake. The events over, Washington left their mark, not in alarm or fear, but in the gentle, persistent ways that curiosity reshapes a city and its people. The glowing lights that had drifted across the night sky had vanished. The radar blips had faded, and the jets had returned to their hangars. Yet, like a soft whisper carried by the breeze, the memory of those nights endured, quietly shaping the thoughts, imaginations, and future endeavors of those who had witnessed them. For the Air Force and the investigators of Project Blue Book, the Washington sightings became a defining case, a gentle reminder that the skies could still surprise. Analysts meticulously compiled reports, studied the radar logs, interviewed pilots, and cross-checked every observation. Each file was carefully cataloged, preserving the details for future review. And while many nights had passed without further incident, the importance of documenting and understanding such phenomena became clear. Every log, every statement, every photograph was a quiet investment in knowledge, a recognition that the unknown deserved patient attention. For the people who had witnessed the events firsthand, radar operators, pilots, military personnel, the legacy was less about documentation and more about personal reflection. Long after the lights had disappeared, they carried a gentle sense of awe, an enduring curiosity that lingered like a soft glow in the mind. Many spoke of those nights, not in fear or urgency, but in calm appreciation for having observed something rare, unusual, and beautifully inexplicable. Their experience became a quiet point of connection, shared among colleagues and friends who understood the delicate balance between responsibility and wonder. Beyond the military and professional spheres, the citizens of Washington and beyond absorbed the legacy in subtler, more personal ways. Children who had once traced imaginary paths of the glowing lights with their fingers grew into adults who still glanced at the heavens with the same soft, open curiosity. Neighbors who had exchanged stories during long summer nights retained a sense of shared human wonder, a thread connecting them quietly across time. The Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol Dome, the smooth surface of the Potomac, all had watched the summer sky quietly, absorbing the presence of something unexplainable. These silent witnesses held the memory of the lights in stone and water and reflected moonlight, a calm, eternal testament to the nights when the world paused to marvel at the unexpected. Over time, the Washington sightings also shaped public interest in aviation, atmospheric science, and the study of unidentified aerial phenomena. Young students became fascinated by the skies and the mechanics of flight. Aspiring scientists and engineers read the reports with wide-eyed curiosity, inspired by the knowledge that the universe still held secrets and that the act of observation could uncover wonders. Libraries quietly accumulated books and reports on atmospheric anomalies and radar phenomena, and across the country, the notion that the heavens might contain more than was immediately visible became a comforting, enduring thought. In the broader context of UFO history, the events of 1952 over Washington held a gentle, pivotal place. They were not a story of panic, chaos, or fear. Rather, they became a chapter of quiet fascination, a narrative that encouraged both meticulous investigation and imaginative reflection. Scholars and enthusiasts alike would revisit these nights, poring over declassified documents, photographs, and personal accounts. And in every revisitation, the same gentle lesson emerged, that humanity's curiosity is an enduring bridge between knowledge and wonder. Even as decades passed and technology advanced, the legacy of those midsummer nights remained. Yet the Washington skies of July 1952 continued to inspire. Every time someone looked upward on a quiet night, they could imagine the soft, gliding lights, the shimmering trails, and the stillness that had accompanied them. The memory was a lullaby for the curious mind, a story that whispered, "There is still so much to see, to wonder, and to cherish." And perhaps, most importantly, the legacy of the Washington sightings reminded humanity of something subtle, enduring, and profoundly human: the capacity to experience awe without fear, to embrace the unknown with gentle curiosity, and to find connection in moments of shared wonder. The radar operators, the pilots, the journalists, the neighbors, and the children, all were threads in a quiet tapestry that stretched across time and memory, linking people through the simple act of noticing the sky and marveling at what it might hold. They became a soft meditation on the human experience itself, the moments when we pause, look upward, and remember that the world is vast, mysterious, and filled with possibility. They became a story, not of explanation, but of reverence, a narrative that could be told and retold with calm, reflective voices, gently guiding listeners to imagine the past without anxiety, to feel connected to those who came before, and to drift toward a sense of peace and quiet awe. On quiet nights, when the wind drifts softly across the monuments and the moonlight shimmers on the Potomac, it is possible to imagine those glowing lights returning, not as a threat, not as a spectacle, but as subtle visitors in the vast, sleeping sky. And perhaps that is the truest gift of the modern perspective. It teaches us that mystery is not the absence of understanding, but the presence of possibility. That even in an age of satellites, radar, and instant communication, the universe retains its quiet magic, and that human curiosity remains a bridge, connecting past and present, data and imagination, memory and wonder. The Washington sightings of 1952, when viewed through modern eyes, encourage us to pause, to reflect, and to gaze upward. They remind us that the sky is a canvas of subtle motion, soft light, and infinite patterns. They remind us that humanity is a witness, a participant, and a storyteller, bound together across decades by moments of shared awe. And they remind us, gently, that the unknown is not something to fear, but something to honor, imagine, and embrace. Even now, the lights of the past seem to drift quietly across the mind's sky. They encourage calm observation, patient inquiry, and a reflective imagination that stretches across generations. The modern perspective is not a conclusion, but a continuation, a quiet thread connecting those midsummer nights in 1952 to the present moment, reminding us that wonder endures softly and persistently, like starlight shimmering over a sleeping city. And so, as we look upward, we see not only the distant stars, but the faint echoes of those glowing lights, a gentle, unhurried invitation to wonder, to reflect, and to drift into the quiet embrace of the unknown. As the final traces of twilight fade over Washington, a stillness settles across the city. The monuments stand quietly beneath the moon, their marble surfaces pale and serene, reflecting soft beams of starlight. The Potomac flows like liquid glass, its gentle current whispering stories only the night can hear. And somewhere above it all, the sky stretches, vast and infinite, holding within its darkness the memory of midsummer nights when glowing lights drifted gracefully, silently across the heavens. We can close our eyes and imagine it all once more. The calm hum of radar rooms, the soft glow of screens illuminating attentive faces, the pilot's hands steady on controls, watching shimmering lights glide past distant clouds. The families on their porches, children pointing upward, eyes wide with wonder. Journalists and civilians, all caught in the quiet magic of something they could see but not fully explain. Everyone connected in the subtle, shared acknowledgement that the world is far bigger and more mysterious than we often allow ourselves to imagine. Perhaps that is the most enduring gift of those nights. The gentle reminder that mystery need not be frightening, that the unknown can be soft, even soothing, when we approach it with calm curiosity and an open heart. It is a lesson whispered in the hum of machinery, in the hush of quiet streets, in the slow, steady flow of the Potomac beneath the moon. It is a lesson that spans generations, carried forward in memories, in stories, in the quiet reflections of those who paused to look upward and allowed themselves to wonder. When we allow our minds to drift through those warm summer nights, it is easy to feel connected, not just to the people who were there, but to something larger, something enduring. The lights themselves, whatever they may have been, become symbols of possibility. They remind us that the universe holds surprises, that our perspective is only one among many, and that the act of observation, of curiosity, is itself a form of quiet magic. Even today, in our busy world of constant movement and endless information, we can take a moment to pause. We can imagine the night sky over Washington in July of 1952, the warm air brushing against our faces, the faint hum of distant traffic, the soft glimmer of lights moving across the darkness above. And as we breathe in this memory, we carry with us the calm, reflective awe of those who witnessed it firsthand, the radar operators, the pilots, the families, the journalists, and the ordinary citizens who simply looked up and marveled. That awe is timeless. It does not fade with decades, nor does it diminish with knowledge. It is a quiet ember that warms the heart, a gentle whisper that invites us to slow down, to notice, and to dream. We can imagine standing once more on the Lincoln Memorial steps, or leaning against a familiar balcony railing, watching the distant glow of something that defied explanation. The details are soft now, the exact patterns, the shapes, the numbers, but the feeling remains vivid, a sense of wonder, a recognition of connection, a reminder that life is bigger than the immediate, the everyday, the fully known. And as we carry this reflection into our own lives, we begin to see that the world itself offers countless quiet moments of awe, if only we pause to observe. A bird gliding across the sky, the soft ripple of water beneath a bridge, the faint flicker of distant lights at night. Each is a reminder that there is always more than meets the eye, more than our minds can immediately grasp, and that the unknown need not be feared. It can be a lullaby, a meditation, a gentle journey into quiet contemplation. So, as you lie here, letting the day's worries melt away, imagine the soft glow of the 1952 lights drifting across the night sky. Feel the warmth of midsummer air, the calm of a city that has learned to pause, to breathe, and to look upward together. Let your mind wander through the radar rooms, across the pilot cabins, along the quiet streets and porches where stories were shared, where eyes met skyward in silent companionship. Allow yourself to drift slowly, carried by the gentle rhythm of memory and imagination. The world is vast, yes, but it is also intimate. The unknown is not a threat, but an invitation. And above all, the shared wonder of those who came before us reminds us that curiosity.com and reflection are enduring companions. Tonight, you are part of that tapestry. Your mind, your heart, your imagination, all are connected to the quiet story of the lights above Washington. And as you breathe, as you relax, as you allow sleep to carry you forward, know that this connection, this soft human wonder, is timeless. It drifts gently across decades, across skies, across generations, like a slow, luminous dance among the stars. Rest now. Let the rhythm of your own breathing echo the calm of those midsummer nights. Let your thoughts float lightly, carried by the gentle hum of the universe. The lights may have vanished from the sky long ago, but their essence remains, a quiet testament to curiosity, to wonder, and to the shared human experience of gazing upward and feeling softly that the world is more magnificent than we can ever fully know. Sleep peacefully, cradled by the knowledge that mystery endures, that awe persists, and that the quiet beauty of the unknown is always just above, waiting for you to look up, breathe deeply, and dream.